Thanks everyone again for joining us. This is the very first installment of this session, which is exploring strategic alliances for nonprofits. If you have not met me before, my name is Liz and I use the pronoun she, her. I'm the education coordinator for Integral.org and I'm around hosting, monitoring the chat, any sort of tech support, and explaining Mural later. So once again, if you could change your Zoom name to your full name, it would just help me later when we make our breakout rooms. And this session, as mentioned, will be pretty interactive. And we are happy to get any of your thoughts, comments, scenarios in the chat box down there. So you can turn your cameras on and just be ready to, have a nice, somewhat in-person feeling of a virtual Zoom meeting. So with that, let's get on to the land acknowledgement. Okay. So we'd like to acknowledge that Integral.org is based out of Mohkinstsis, which is the Blackfoot name for elbow. And this refers to the confluence of Elbow and Bow rivers that run through Treaty 7 territory. Mohkinstsis is the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai, as well as the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, which consists of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina First Nations, and finally the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. At Integral.org, our team recognizes that there's an existing tension between the legal and governance structures that we work within and our efforts towards truth and reconciliation. And so we accept our responsibility to work towards reconciling this tension. And we all have a connection and responsibility to the lands that host our lives, our communities, and our work. And with that, I'm very happy to introduce our facilitators today. We have Mike Grogan. He's the president and CEO of Integral.org. From board governance and strategy development and sustainability planning, Mike has over 30 years of experience where he's recognized for his ability to inspire nonprofit organizations to tackle complex issues and create impactful and lasting solutions that fit the changing needs of their organization. And as CEO of diverse organizations and understands firsthand the complex challenges facing management, staff, and boards in the nonprofit sector. And she's been providing training to nonprofit organizations for over a decade, supporting them through their risk management journeys and otherwise. And then we'll do that. So yeah, with that, we'll take it away.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you to all of you for joining us. As Liz mentioned, and I do know it's a very busy time, and as we wander through any of our own work here, we realize that people are sort of getting through to hopefully the holiday break. So I'm really glad you spent time with us. And really, just as we go through all our stuff today, this is a chance for you to learn. So we've got content, we've got some exercises, we've got stuff planned. We can put a lot of material out there. But really, the whole point of these workshops and these times together are that you get your questions answered or plant some ideas. So if you do have a thought or a question, if there's anything we're saying that doesn't quite make sense, you want to sort of delve a bit further into or share some of your own insights, by all means, pop up a hand. Liz will be watching for it. I tend to ignore those things, but they'll tell me. They're good that way. And just let us know. So whatever we can do to make this a deeper and richer learning experience for you, that's what we're here to do. And that's what we do at Integral.org. Our job is to help other charities and nonprofits do what you do better. So we are a charity, we're a nonprofit, and our world consists of doing governance work, doing legal work, doing strategy work, and now leadership development is our four big pillars of work. So much of the same things you'll wrestle with in your nonprofit, we wrestle with every day. So we do this alongside you, not folks who are outside the sector. Today, we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about this thing called strategic alliances, not necessarily a common term. I think all the components of it, as we break it down and give you some better understanding of that, there's nothing you won't have bumped up against or seen or heard of. I think a lot of these things you do every day in terms of that sort of the one end of the continuum. The upper end of the continuum, we're talking about corporate changes and maybe mergers and stuff like that, maybe a little more rare, perhaps. I think getting perhaps few more than we might have saw before COVID. One of the questions we saw in the pre-questions for this registration was, are we seeing more of these kind of formal integrations? And the answer certainly is yes for us right now, is that I think some of the impacts of COVID are just starting to coming home now. We're seeing more of these things driving things forward. So we'll talk about collaborations, what we call formal alliances, and those corporate integrations, which get into that merger and amalgamation, consolidation kind of stuff. We'll give you a bit of an exercise to play with some of the concepts and this sort of talk through the steps of doing this. We've got a number of these on the go right now at Integra Org, so we're kind of sharing with you in real time maybe our process through this whole range of options. And I guess that's the main thing to take away. You've got a range of options here. There's no one right way or appropriate way, or even one way that you may choose many ways forward to work with other folks. Starting with a bit of a proverb, whether it's an African proverb, I'm not quite sure. Every time I say where it's from, somebody tells me it's somewhere else. But and we've probably all heard it. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. The idea that what can you do to go better together, do better together than you could alone. And there's, even though it's on the surface, maybe a fairly easy quote, it does raise a number of questions for you. What do you really want to do and why? Where do you want to be? Where are you today and where you want to be? How fast do you want to get there and what do you want to do? So when we talk about all the ranges of strategic alliances, the underlying question is why. It's not the how, it's not necessarily the what you come up with, it's the why. And why we will come back to that over and over again, because the why is going to set you down a path. And it's not that most of those paths are, you can sort of adjust to a certain point sometimes, but getting that why really, really nailed down at the front end is super, super important. Another way of praising this is from a nice little piece, and we'll give you some resources at the end here. We'll tell you where our resources come from, what the limitations are, and where they're appropriate, where they're not. The Muttart Foundation, a Alberta-based foundation, along with Miller Thompson, a national law firm, wrote a nice guide to mergers in the nonprofit sector, probably a couple years, 3 years back now, it looks like. But nice quote from that: "Planning your future is always better than having your future overtake you." And it'll speak to this, and you'll hear this throughout the presentation. Is when do you start thinking about moving down the path to some sort of alliance? And if you leave it too late and you sort of lose that ability to control your future, it makes it a lot harder for you. So if you're doing things out of a sense of desperation or it's last minute, those tend to not work as well. There's still options, certainly in there. But it's a lot easier if these are strategic. And when we use the word strategic, we really use that intentionally. It is making an informed choice, knowing where you are today and where you want to be in the future. And when we do strat planning, it's really that simple. It's getting from A to B. But you got to really take a good hard look at A, that place we're at today, and what that might look like in the future, and where you want to be. And then we pick the route forward in that. So that's what we call a strategic alliance, is saying, what do we do on those routes between A and B that are actually the best way for your organization? And in Alberta, we've got 30,000 plus nonprofits out there. So there's a lot of different circumstances that will feed into this kind of stuff. So to give you a sense of what this whole world looks like here, we're going to give you a continuum. And this is, I'll tell you, this is from a gentleman named David LaPiana. He is American. So there are times when we certainly will bring in materials. When we're looking at regulatory pieces, when we're looking at some of the governance pieces, legislative pieces, we'll always use Alberta or Canadian ones as appropriate. This is a conceptual piece. And so in terms of thinking the big buckets of what a strategic alliance is, this is a pretty good one because it conceptually lets us look at where we might fall on a continuum here, like where we might want to go in terms of what the options are before us. And if you start at the very left side, I guess, we're starting the same screen. Sure we are. We have the idea that you're very autonomous. You're still staying an individual organization. As you move to the far right side of the diagram, you're losing some of that autonomy. You're more integrated. So we're talking about corporate structures starting to come together. You're changing your legal frameworks. You're changing some of the things about your nonprofit. And that's far more complex. So all these pieces, we'll walk through each one of these. I'll give you just a brief overview now, and then we'll unpack each of these with some examples and some things you need to think about along the way. So very far right, it's a collaboration. Nonprofits, I think, know this stuff really well. I think it's stuff that we do pretty much every day in some form or other. It's the idea that we can do things better with another partner alongside us. Somebody who helps us do our work in a way that is beneficial to us. We're remaining separate organizations, so we're not changing anything. These can be very short term. They can actually be quite informal. There may be just a very light or in sometimes almost no agreement in doing some of these things. But it's the way that decision-making power sits with each organization. It fits us better to do our work this way. And should that change, then we can move away fairly easily. Those are easy to put together sometimes, easier to pull apart. I guess complexity may increase or decrease some within that, but we're not making any major changes. We're not changing our organizational structure. We're not changing our purposes. We're probably not even changing a whole lot of how we work, except on some minor areas. As we move towards the center, we get to a different level, probably an increased level of what integration and what an alliance might look like. And this is what we call a formal alliance. This one's probably not quite as clear cut because there's a lot of ways to describe the work that goes into this, the types of work that might be in this one. So you're still operating as separate entities, but you're starting to align more of your operational components or programmatic components in ways that are perhaps a little more permanent or at least harder to pull apart. So in this area, we get joint programming. We're going to get some administrative consolidation. Sometimes you'll see organizations that take on the administrative or back office functions for many nonprofits. There's things you have to consider in terms of, is that part of what you should be doing? But you're giving away some of your operational pieces to another organization or sharing those perhaps. So now decision making is shared. You've got agreements in place. These tend to be a little more complex. How will we jointly move forward in a program? How will we jointly move forward if you're doing some of my back office stuff? So again, not permanent changes necessarily, but probably ones that are more complex and need some more time, a little more thoughtfulness, and can go a lot of ways. Some of these areas are probably more common to us. I think there's lots of joint programming ones. I'll give some examples. Back office or that administrative consolidation, not quite as prevalent here. Other jurisdictions, other regions, you'll see where the idea of a management service organization that does the back office work for a lot of nonprofits, being a nonprofit itself. Those are quite common. We don't have that structure as much, but it's a way of increasing efficiency, increasing impact in the programming side of things. At the very far right of the screen, we get this corporate integration piece, where we're now starting to change how a nonprofit or a charity may legally structure itself. And this is where we're making changes to the corporate structure, making changes perhaps to the charitable side of the thing. And that takes a lot more thoughtfulness. It's an area where you do want to bring in some legal supports on this. When we get to this, we'll talk through what some of those considerations are. We're not going to give you legal advice in this. That's not our role today here, but to point out that there are some significant legal issues or regulatory issues to be aware of and to make sure you're finding solutions that are appropriate to your nonprofit. 30,000 nonprofits out there in Alberta, 9,000 charities. I know some folks are joining us from beyond Alberta, so different numbers there and different regulatory frameworks. But it's going to differ depending on how you're structured, what act you're under, and whether or not you're a charity. So we'll unpack that a bit and give you some way to understand that kind of stuff. But at that far right of the spectrum, this is where you are integrated, where decision-making enters into one body. So one body may go away or be amalgamated or consolidated. We'll walk through all that. This is getting to more ones that are more permanent. So you're not pulling these things apart really easily if you do this kind of stuff. There always are steps along the way, and we'll walk you through some of those steps. But you're into that far right. If you're into that amalgamation, merger, consolidation, we'll break those down for you. You're probably not going backwards from those places once you reach a certain point. Okay. There we go. We'll start with, I think, collaboration. I'm going to pass over to Leslie to take this part for us. Leslie?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, we wanted to dig a little bit more into what collaboration means and what it looks like. But I'm sure actually many of you have been involved in collaboration. So as Mike said, this is kind of at the beginning of the continuum where you're still maintaining your autonomy. But often it's to our advantage to work together with other agencies, whether they're from within our sector or from outside of our sector. So no permanent commitment, but sometimes it's really of value for us to come together. So sometimes we can overcome more complex problems, or maybe we need to advocate on behalf of our services or on behalf of a group of people. Maybe it's around learning something together or having a bit of a network. So this could be anything from interagency councils. I used to work in the disability sector, and we were funded by Persons with Developmental Disabilities, Government of Alberta, and they would do routine funding cuts to us. And so together as agencies, as part of our interagency committee, we would band together and respond as a collective because we had more power that way. So often this is, pulling on each other's strengths. It gives you a bigger voice in the sector. An example of this probably, sorry, sorry, I've got that cold, everybody has. So things about collaboration, it gives us, it still gives us the flexibility of being our own agency and pursuing our own goals. But if we want to pool expertise or pool resources, or as I said, amplify a policy message, create shared wisdom, maybe you're going through a whole learning process together. And so you're, bringing in some expertise, but you're sharing the costs, but there's no long-term commitment here. So it's usually around a specific outcome you're looking for. And then you go back to doing business how you always were. One of the probably most well-known examples of collaboration was the Resolve campaign. And this was a pretty formal collaboration. So it's starting to get into that, I think, middle of the continuum a little more. But this is when a number of partner agencies decided to come together in terms of fundraising. So they recognized that they were kind of competing for the same dollars from the same people. And that wasn't a very efficient way to do business. So 9 agencies came together and they raised a total of $120 million towards affordable housing and supported rental housing for more than 3,000 vulnerable and homeless Calgarians. So incredibly successful campaign. They were supported by a fundraising group called Vitrio. Many of you probably have heard of them. But this was really unique, and I think a wonderful example we can learn from when they all benefited by coming together. And alone, they probably never would have been able to raise the kind of funds that each agency ended up getting out of that campaign, because each agency ended up with their own piece of the pie. So something to think about. We're always kind of out there competing for the same dollars, but this was a different way of doing it. It turned out to be an amazing experiment. So Mike's going to tell you a little bit more about formal alliances.
Thank you, Leslie. So as you move to that middle part of the continuum now, and this is, some of these you can sort of, the lines aren't quite as perhaps clean. So where you sort of stop being a collaboration, where you enter a formal alliance, that's going to vary from situation to situation. So again, this is the idea that you're still remaining independent organizations. But you're making maybe moves that are a little more structured, a little more baked in, maybe permanent, maybe not, because you still can back off your organization, your independence still, so you can still move on to some of these things. But you're making some shifts that move beyond kind of those temporal things. So even Resolve, which was years long, the example before, they moved back once that was over. They went back to doing their things by themselves. There's perhaps a second stage to that, but you're not making anything major change. You go back to the way it was. So in formal alliances, you're working together for the foreseeable future is kind of the nice frame for that. This is something where you are intending. And this may be at times a way of starting to test out, do we want to even go further than this? So the example I'll give it a minute or two here is of a group that is probably not quite ready. They don't think for an integration to start to think, they want to try something that could this really work? So it's a bit of a perhaps dating before you get married kind of analogy to work with that. So when we're talking about formal alliances, lots of things in this. This is, it can do a couple things. And then a couple ways you can frame it. Is it a better way to get your work done? Can it accelerate the excess of what you want to do? Is it a better impact model? Is it better for us to pool some resources from you, some resources from us, and for the foreseeable future, move forward that way together? So enhanced programming. The other side is that maybe it's just more efficient. Maybe there's things that we're doing, the things that you're doing, that perhaps we should enter into some sort of alliance. And that alliance can be written very broadly. Right now we share space in our office. So we have another organization that works with us. So instead of us sort of each having our own office space, it's far more efficient for us to share the space. We share some common areas, share some common costs. We sort of bump into each other here and there. That is a way of having a version of a formal alliance. Certainly ones can go a lot further than that. A lot of the back office ones can be very complex in terms of your accounting systems, IT systems, some do shared communications, things like that. But whatever it might be, that we're sort of working more in a true partnership together, where we're co-laboring, we're each carrying some of the work, some of the weight, and we're bearing some of the responsibilities. But it's impacting and advancing both of our missions. It is work that does that separately, we're still able to advance our mission, but we're doing it better together. I'm going to give you an idea of one that was quite interesting to work with. And one thing to sort of think about, if you have the idea of efficiency, more robust efficiency, they're longer, more formal type things. You can't necessarily pop out of these tomorrow, but you can get out of them. You still have a lot of autonomy. So more efficiencies, perhaps, better programs and services, shared benefits and risks of generating, whether in social enterprise or a venture. This is one that's, I think, quite interesting. Sometimes when you're a smaller, it doesn't mean any size, but sometimes it's more prevalent in smaller nonprofits, is that an opportunity arises and sometimes a big grant comes up. We've seen this in the last couple of years here, where some major granting streams come out. And they're both asking for collaboration, which is, the funder-driven collaboration is probably a bit of a different question for us. But sometimes there's a level of work here that's just too much for an organization. And should we partner with somebody to do it? Maybe we have different skill sets. Maybe we have different levels of resources we can bring to the mix. But sometimes it's just a way of sharing the risk to say, if I were to apply for $1 million grant for Integral Org, that's going to double the size of my organization. That's a pretty big swing. If I can share some of that work with a like-minded organization that has similar values, similar ways of working, similar objects or purposes, then that's probably a way of reducing that risk. Now, there's risk obviously in collaboration, but you can structure these things to certainly work on as a risk reduction type of way of doing things. Again, networking and sharing learning. You'll see some of that through some of our examples, some of the things that it's just a better way to work with stuff. These, again, can be kind of precursors. We're working on an organization project right now that probably is going to be a merger. We'll talk to you why that's probably, because there's stages along the way. But they're alongside that or before that working on shared programming. They're aligning some of their program requirements, some of their training, some of their ways of standardizing their sort of procedures. So whether or not the more formal integration goes forward, they will still have this joint programming area, which they can both benefit from individually. And should they continue to work together side by side, that will still be of value. So again, sometimes precursors to more formal integrations, sometimes just a better way of doing things, and sometimes just more efficient. So a nice example of this one that we got to work with a little while ago, and this is another public website you can take a look at. This is called Connect FASD, Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder. So this was an interesting one to work with. This is two organizations, both in the fetal alcohol space, one in a bigger city, one in a smaller town. And realized that they had so many resources and so many ways of doing things that were really just the same thing. So each had their own website, each had their own resource library up there that they would have to constantly update and put on new material and reformat it. Each was doing some level of training. Both of them had aspirations to do more client sort of crisis contact, to have a 24-hour phone line perhaps, but neither really had the resources to do that. So they came up with the idea. They weren't really saying we could just join together yet. That may or may not happen. I don't know that's happening. But they thought, what if there's a better way to offer our public-facing or client-facing products and services that isn't just two organizations that are putting the same stuff up and it gets confusing for folks. So they made the decision to do joint programming in the area of resources to start with. So they both took down their corporate websites. They don't have an individual website anymore. They have one public-facing website, which is called Connect FASD. And they took down their own resources on their websites, made one set of resources. They're sharing staffing time to populate the website to keep it up to date, to make sure that it's got consistent resources, the language is the same. So you avoided some duplication. It sort of checks that box on efficiency. It's getting better products out there because you've got two organizations kind of feeding latest type of stuff. And from that, they've been able to say, well, we've got maybe more resources to put into some training things. So now they're doing joint training pieces. They're going to move forward with that 24-hour call line. What was really quite remarkable about this is that they were so proud of the final product of having Connect FASD and this beautiful new website that they kind of forgot to put their organization's names on it. That it was the idea that this is a better way of doing programming for clients. And that when I sort of looked at the draft, I thought, this is wonderful. It's a really good site, but I can't tell who you are. And there is a humility there. There was quite a remarkable commitment to this is just a better way to move forward. So really cool one. So there's lots of them like that, but that one is one that we sort of have a chance to sort of work with intimately over the last couple of years here. And as we move forward in sort of the big range of options, this is the area where we get into corporate integration. And this is one that can be it's certainly more complex in some ways. In some ways, it's less complex because this is where we get into a lot of rules and a lot of things where there are regulatory environments. And while there may be lots of steps to go through, the nice thing about regulatory environments, they tend to have the rules fairly well laid out. So the grayness and the nuance and the human factor tends to fall off a bit here. And this is where you get lots of rules to follow. Just to be clear, when we talk about this kind of stuff, that Integral Org is a approved legal service provider here in Alberta. I am not a lawyer. Leslie is not a lawyer. And so we're not giving you legal advice. So we're not going to talk about the specific circumstances of your organization. If you do want to talk about that, we've got legal clinics for sure. We can sit you down with our legal counsel, free one-on-one. She can walk you through the specifics for your organization. If you need it immediately, there are lots of charity lawyers out there. Our guidance in this would be this, is that there are regulatory issues out there when you move into the corporate integration, where you're changing the structure of an organization. It's really important you understand both how you're incorporated and if you're a charity, and there's differences in terms of what you may or may not do in both those spaces, and then get appropriate guidance to make sure you're making an informed decision. Okay? So moving forward with this, there's lots of things you can do. The corporate integration can be a very powerful tool. Again, I think we're starting to see more of it. One of the things that COVID did, I thought we'd see more kind of middle of, I'm not sure when the middle or end of COVID is, or when I say after COVID, that's probably not true either. The idea that, we came out of sort of that first really big chunks of COVID, I thought we'd see more of organizations really struggling. I think it was lagged a fair bit. I'm an economist, so I kind of watch sort of when ups and downs of sort of economic cycles affect the nonprofit sector. I think for years I would have said that the nonprofit sector lags the overall economy from about 6 months to a year. So when the overall economy sort of goes down into recession, we take a while to go down, we take a while to follow it back up. I think that lags a little longer right now. And I think what we're seeing in many ways is the impacts of COVID, some of those funding programs, support programs that came off probably about a year ago now. All that's really starting to sort of come home to roost, and maybe some of the weaknesses that were there before, plus all the pressures right now, inflation and workforce and all those kind of things. We're seeing more pressures on nonprofit than we perhaps you have. So we are seeing, I think, more organizations thinking about this. Again, this is one of the things that you want to think about as far in advance as you can, because both the implications of this are really significant, but also the steps you need to take to do this well do take a fair bit of time. So when probably conceived, this is a great way of strengthening yourselves. You can benefit from a partner's experience. It is a two-way street. Sometimes when you look at integrations like this, it looks like somebody acquiring another organization. That is quite often sort of pieces get acquired that way. When they're done in a more mutual sense, this is both organizations changing. This is organizations that one may go through a much more significant change because they may actually disappear. But both organizations will change. So it is really important for both parties to really think through what this really means and the why and the how, and is this the right piece for you to move forward on? So a couple pieces to think about this. If you want to really combine, you've got saying, I've got some specific skills or areas to grow within. This may be a way to go. Sometimes we sort of grow nonprofits through, adding funding and adding new programs, and that's a traditional nonprofit growth way, and there's nothing wrong with that. We all do that, I think. It's looking to do that. But sometimes you're thinking, well, I really want to sort of move into a new area, and if somebody else is right in that space, is it better for us to have a conversation on how we might do that together? And is that an integration, a corporate integration, where we're sort of changing the legal structures of what we do? So again, some of these things are depending on the level of change that you want to walk through. Just some concepts on terminology here. We're going to give you some definitions. These are from the Canada Revenue Agency. So if you are a charity, there are different considerations taken into account. Just to recognize what one jurisdiction or one group calls a merger, consolidation, or amalgamation may not be the same as what other groups call that. So as you move from province to province, if you look at different materials, if you read stuff from the States, we won't bring any definitions from the States for this one, but sometimes people call a merger that isn't really a merger. So it's really clear, because this is the idea that what you're sort of going after, there is terminology that really matters. Again, this is a chance for you to sort of tap into some legal guidance. CRA has some great materials on here. We'll give you some of their definitions, but again, go back and make sure you get the proper guidance on this. So you can join together as one entity. So whether you want to sort of, I'll give you 3 different models that CRA has laid out here. Amalgamation, merger, and consolidation are kind of the 3 big buckets. They are interchangeable sometimes, but they're not necessarily in terms of the structure, and we're going to go through here. So again, think through the terminology, make sure it fits in your jurisdiction, and get some help along the way. I'll give you three graphics in this. I'll read through some definitions. I'll give you sort of how these really look like. So the CRA, we've written this up in a blog too. It'll be part of the resources here. Amalgamation, two or more organizations join together by bringing their assets, liabilities, and members into a new organization they become. The original organizations do not cease to exist or dissolve. They simply flow into and continue to exist with the new amalgamated organization. I'll explain that in the graphics. So just think these are like two rivers flowing together. They continue forward together as one river. But the merger is where one organization winds up its affairs, transfers assets to an already existing organization. No new entity is created, so one takes on all the assets, liability, perhaps some of the people and programs, not all of them necessarily. So one is probably a little bigger, one goes away. That's a merger, and that's probably one of the more sort of well-known structures, and that's not I'd say more of a common one. Consolidation is where you've got two organizations who perhaps want to join together, but instead of one going away and one maybe growing, you create a new organization. So both organizations, or all, there could be more than two obviously here, transfer all assets into a newly created entity. So it can be, the two other organizations perhaps go away and you've got a new one. So I'll give you three quick examples of what this perhaps looks like, me a little graphically. I'm a visual learner, so sometimes that helps us in this one. So an amalgamation, this is where you join together. You don't get rid of an organization. You get this A and B coming together in an organization that has elements of A and B moving together forward that way. The merger is where you've got agency A, agency B. In this case, the assets from agency B are transferred to agency B, and agency A, and agency B no longer exists. They'll go through the process of transferring assets, program, liabilities, all that kind of good stuff, and then move into the process of winding down their charity and their nonprofit, which can be a quite lengthy time piece too. So none of these things happen really fast, and we'll talk through some of the governance steps along the way you need to make sure you're adhering to, but these are not necessarily quick moving things. And the final is the consolidation. This is where we're taking agency A, B, they're both going to put their assets into their liabilities, all their stuff into agency C, and start a new agency. Again, you've got lots of complexity in that because agency C needs to be set up, needs to be incorporated. If you're going to become a charity, you make sure all these components actually do fit together in the new charitable entity. So again, getting some guidance on that and taking your time to make sure we walk through all of this. Leslie's been through a few of these. I'm going to let her sort of share a few examples of what she has done, I think in the merger space, perhaps more than the other ones.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. So I had the privilege of being involved in what was originally called Indefinite Arts Center. Some of you may have been familiar with the organization, which was a program for individuals, primarily with developmental disabilities, largely focused on doing kind of creative arts. And when they had a new CEO come online about 5 years ago, that CEO had a vision that was much, much bigger. They wanted to get the artists recognized on a national and even an international level. And they wanted to offer more variety of opportunities for the type of art that people could be engaged in. And so I helped facilitate the merger of two smaller organizations, Momo Dance, you may have heard of, and the second one was Artistic Expressions. And they were both agencies. Obviously, Momo Dance is a dance organization, primarily serving individuals with disabilities, and Artistic Expressions provided art classes for individuals with physical disabilities. But the vision of the CEO was that, again, this kind of expanded opportunity. And so we worked through the merger with these two smaller organizations who both ended up winding up their fairs and transferring their programs and their assets into Indefinite Arts, which then rebranded and became National Access Arts Center. And the transformation that this resulted in was just absolutely amazing. It allowed individuals who were involved in the organization to have much more opportunities in terms of cross-discipline arts. So it kind of has snowballed. So they brought in dance. Now they do a lot of visual arts, performing arts. They've done national, they've done international displays. They've taken artists across the world. I mean, it's just a snowball. It's just been this incredible, if you look back from about 7 years ago, where Indefinite Arts was, and now where National Access Arts Center was. And it was because of the, of course, vision, but the mergers allowed them to expand and expand both who they served and what services they offered. Now, this was not all straightforward. There was individuals on the boards of the smaller organizations who had been founding members. And so you can imagine the anxiety of agreeing to wind up your organization when your son or daughter is still involved and you are the board chair and you have been the board chair for 15 years. But I was just so proud of how they worked through the emotional aspects of this and really focused on what are we trying to accomplish. And as Mike said, the why is so important. And at the end of the day, the merger was seen as the way to go. The two smaller organizations were really struggling with a lack of infrastructure and being able to do all the requirements of being a charity. And all they really wanted to do was provide direct services. And so, but one thing to think about, you can't really tell from the outside what the legal structure changes have been because they rebranded at the same time. I mean, you can't tell, is this a consolidation? Is this amalgamation? Or is this a merger from the outside? You really have to dig into it to see how it worked out. But this was an amazing example. And as I said, I was just very privileged to be involved in it. The second example, I had different experience in. I was with Habitat for Humanity Calgary. And my second day on the job, I was informed that 3 small Habitat affiliates had been told by the national office that they had to merge with us. I wouldn't really recommend that is how you approach mergers. It doesn't really start with positive relationships. And these were small rural affiliates who were all struggling. They were not building many homes and they were struggling with having enough volunteers and of course infrastructure and meeting the standards required as being part of a national organization. And I felt like Goldilocks, to be honest. I had one of them was very, very resistant to the merger. One of the groups, they did not want to merge. They literally did not want anything to do with us and were forced into this. And so it was actually very ugly. We tried for 2 years to create relationships and to work together. And at the end, we just had to say, you know what, this isn't working. Thank you very much for your service. And they ended up being forced to wind up their affairs and transfer their assets by the national office. So I wouldn't recommend that at all. The second group couldn't merge fast enough. The day that we agreed, the office door opened and about 30 boxes got, shoved down our hall and the door slammed and away they ran. And we never really saw them again. And so again, you don't want to do it that way. But the third group was, I think, again, a nice example of how you can work through challenges to get to a good outcome. The third group was a Habitat affiliate who was actually doing okay, but long-term was probably not sustainable. But, they had built some homes, they had some structure in place. And so we really worked with them on how do we maintain your identity in your community? Because, big city people going out to rural areas and telling them what to do is not how we wanted to behave. So how do we keep your volunteers on the ground? How do you get involved? How do you continue to be involved in selecting the families, in building the houses? And how do we support you, even though you're actually under our umbrella now? But how do we support you to continue to do the good work that you're doing? And so that one ended up working out really well. So you kind of can get a whole bunch of range in how these things go, and they're not always predictable from the start. But it's all about the process and, working through the process. And we'll talk a little bit later about some things to consider, to make it a positive experience, even if at the end of the day you decide not to follow through. So Mike, I'm going to turn it back to you.
You betcha. Thank you, Leslie. I mean, I think the idea of the why, like that, as Leslie pointed from those 2 examples, and there's lots in those 2 that, the roots of these things can be anywhere, right? So there's not one why, or, and we'll go back to this again. Why are you doing this? And if somebody's telling you to do something, as in any parts of our lives or operations, if somebody sort of orders you to do something and you're not bought in, that's probably a little tougher road to hoe. So the idea if there's, perhaps more of a mutuality, or we're coming to me organically, whatever that might mean, that's probably an easier way to get into this. So again, why do you want to do this? And again, no one right why to do this. that the driver is going to change for every organization. And I think there are some commonalities. We're seeing a number right now where in different ways, executive transition is played out in different ways. It sometimes give organizations or boards of directors who should be driving a lot of this process to say, is there a better way to go forward here? Or is there an opportunity here for us that perhaps was there, but maybe just becomes a little more poignant now. We've got to make a change at that executive level anyway. For some folks, it's hard to find an executive leader these days. The market, I think, has shifted a little bit to say, is this something that is such an important thing that there's a different way of doing things? I think perhaps some of the sustainability pieces are driving some of these decisions, some of these ways of thinking. Again, getting those sort of conversations on the table earlier is better than later. I think if you move into these in a sense of one organization needing to be saved or parts of one organization being saved, it's much harder. Sometimes you might see groups like a national body like Leslie's, or sometimes funders stick a little bit into this. I don't think they direct too many mergers, but they can sort of inform or influence some things. But the why for your organization. So for any board of directors, the standard sort of duty of nonprofit boards is you're there to make decisions in the best interest of the organization. And that's a pretty standard governance concept. What gets tricky is that not every, what is best for your clients or what is best for your purposes or what is best to advance your mission may not be continuing with the organization as structured. And that's challenging for organizations. And it's challenging depending on who's in your organization. If you've got long-term board members or founders or people like that, they tend to like to hold on to the original pieces sometimes. So is that best for the organization? Well, sometimes, but sometimes not. So how do you make those decisions to understand why? And it's a collective why. This is never driven by one person. It's not driven by just a senior executive. It's not driven by one board member. That why needs to be a collective decision saying, at least to start exploring, let's go down that path. When we get to more formal sort of pieces, then that why becomes even more and more important. The question is, are you ready for this? And that's an interesting one, is how do we know we're ready? Well, the answer is you're probably never ready, to tell you the truth, as you get into these things. That what you think you're ready for may not be what you're getting into. As we get into more formal or more complex alliances, the amount of work and the amount of time and the amount of commitment it takes really changes. So at that very far right part of the spectrum, it's collaboration. Yeah, probably not too bad. We do that quite often. I think it's ways of doing things that we're pretty quite used to, and it doesn't necessarily change a lot of how we do things. Hopefully it makes things better, makes them a bit easier. Get into the middle part there. Now we're putting agreements in place. We're getting into ways of being that we've lost some of our autonomy because we're doing shared decision making. That changes some things. So yes, there should be an upside to all these pieces, but nothing comes for free. So recognize what you have to give up when you give up some decision making, some control, maybe loss of some of that direction, hopefully for a better purpose. And then that far part of the continuum, this is one where you need to be really sure, because there are steps along the way, but you get to that point where you decide to wind somebody down. That's a pretty permanent move. So those are ones where it's the idea of readiness is something you can check along the way. But again, we'll talk about due diligence and the steps you need to take along the way. And here you go. How do you approach a partner? Probably, again, no one right or wrong way to do this. I think the ones that we see that are quite successful are where you have a pre-existing relationship with somebody, you know them a bit. When we talk about this is, moving from sort of getting to know somebody to dating to marriage, you're kind of in that sort of same spectrum in some ways. So you probably don't want to do the old bachelor thing where you marry somebody randomly off a TV show and that's permanent, sort of, and do that. So it's good to take that sort of first step along the way, get to know somebody. And we all have these kind of folks in our worlds. I mean, most nonprofits have some awareness of people who are around them, who have similar purposes, similar objects, do similar work in similar ways. Values are super important in this kind of work. And get to know and say, yeah, this is somebody we could do some work with, and sort of find your way around. And maybe then you move into that joint program where you're doing something a little more permanent and say, okay, when we actually start working together, does that really work for us? Yes, it does. And maybe that leads to it. So I think those are the ones that work the best. Yeah, I had somebody phone me once and say, I'm thinking about merging and where can I find somebody? So, well, that's a tough one. You probably want to back it up a step here and let's see if we can find some ways to do that first. Because if somebody phoned me up that I didn't know and said, hey, I want to merge with you, I don't know how far that conversation is going necessarily. So how you approach a partner, those in your network, those around you. And sometimes it takes a bit of work to say, when I talk about there being 30,000 nonprofits in this province, there's no unique nonprofit in this province. I mean, we all think we're individual, unique, we need to be here. Probably not as true as we might think it is. So there are other ways of doing things. And even if it sort of changes some of the makeup, there's better ways to do things for all of us, and ourselves included in that whole mix. But sort of think in general, to sort of summarize all that, we'll give you all this material. You'll get the PowerPoint, recording, all that kind of good stuff. Just, there's lanes here too. So, if you're sort of thinking through this, some of the stuff you already do, if you're thinking you want to sort of pool expertise, resources, or gain influence, I think the advocacy stuff is really good on this one. That's a great example for us to draw upon. There's times when you see in the advocacy world where people just sign a letter together. I'm collaborating with you. We write a joint letter. We're collaborating. That's kind of a nice collaboration piece. But if that's not enough, maybe you need to move a bit more deep on not just in advocacy, but other pieces too, that you need a bit more. Now you're thinking about joint programming. But back in the advocacy thing in Alberta, we have a thing called nonprofit vote. It is a formal alliance between a number of organizations. You buy into this. There's a financial component. There's an oversight component. So we're now getting to agreements and more formal pieces where they just that sort of signing a letter together isn't quite enough. We want formal campaigns. There's an entity created to do that strategic alliance type kind of piece. And then at the top range, if it's not enough to do that, you want to sort of think we need something bigger, more permanent, something that's got a little more depth to it, perhaps. That's where that amalgamation, merger, and consolidation. So again, a bit of a flow through summarizing all of that kind of stuff. But for now, I think we're going to move into a bit of an exercise to make you play with some of this, or let you play with some of this stuff, not make you have to do anything. So there we go. Is this you, Leslie? I believe it is.
Yeah, this
Okay.
is me. Yeah, so we want to give you a chance to kind of explore this in small groups. So we're going to put you into groups of about 4 people each and assign you to different scenarios. So you're each going to have a different scenario, which is 2 agencies that bring to the table different strengths. And you'll have an opportunity to read through your scenario for your group. And then we want you to go through what are the options. So looking at what we've just presented in terms of the whole continuum, talk about, what are the pros and cons of the different options. And then if you can land on one option you think would be in the best interests of the organizations in terms of what they're hoping to accomplish, then, figure out your rationale for that. And then we'll have some debrief time, and we'll ask someone from your group to present back your recommendations and provide your rationale. So we're going to do this in Mural. So I'm going to have Liz just share her screen with Mural. If you're not familiar with Mural, Liz is going to put the link to Mural in the chat function, and you can just click on it and join as a visitor, so you don't have to have an account or anything. If you're not comfortable doing that, when you go into your breakout group, then just ask someone to share their screen so you can see the Mural and you can provide input without actually going into Mural yourself. But I'll let Liz just show you how the Mural is set up. It's fairly easy to navigate if you haven't been there before. But as I said, if you're not comfortable, just ask one of your group members to share their screen so you can participate that way.
Perfect. Thanks, Leslie. So one really important way to navigate Mural is you'll see this icon up here. It's the outline icon. So if you can open up that, that'll help you quickly kind of zoom into all the important pieces. First one I might draw your attention to is number 1, how to use Mural, and it's going to zoom right into this massive mural. So yeah, you can kind of think of Zoom as our room, and then Mural is our wall. So try to have Zoom on one screen and Mural on another. And Leslie already talked about, if you would rather just kind of participate, it's more about the exercise than it is about using Mural. Feel free to just kind of have one person's screen share. So yeah, you have the outline icon up there. You can zoom in and out with your trackball on your mouse, or you can kind of pinch your trackpad. I'm not really sure what device you're using particularly. And in any case, use the undo button. It's up here at the top. That will help you if anything goes wonky. So let's say I'm in breakout group 1. I can click on group 1. That's your scenario here. You can kind of just like click and drag yourself down as you move through the exercises. You'll have these options here just to refresh you. And if you want to put some input on these little sticky notes here, just double click, it'll highlight like this, and then you can just type, type, type. They can fit quite a bit of text in here, so if you want to type full sentences, it totally works. And then just to edit, you can just, delete and go as normal and then click off of it. You shouldn't be able to move, oh, me. Yeah, you'll just drag yourself along the white space and hopefully you won't be able to move any of the things that don't need to move. If there's any questions at this point, happy to answer.
Now you can see in the mirror when you go to your group, so you'll get assigned a breakout group. And then if you go to the outline, you click on your breakout group. So you have to work your way down through your section of the mural. So it will give you your scenario, give you the questions that you're supposed to be thinking about, give you the options to consider. And then as you move through selecting one of those options, it'll ask you, kind of what your rationale is, what are the implications, what are the advantages, etc. So we'll give you about 10 or 15 minutes to work through this as a group. We will pop into your groups just to see how you're doing, if you have any questions. Of course, you can always send us a note in the chat function as well.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to open the rooms.
Any other questions before we send you all? Okay. We will see you in there soon.
Yep. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. Take it away, Leslie.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go over to scenario number 1. So the scenario number 1, we had one large agency and one small agency. And the small agency provided a unique service working with individuals with addictions. And they receive some funding from Alberta Health Services, but most of their funding comes from private donors. And the large agency provides a broad range of mental health services, but their demand for their services is shifting, and they're recognizing a need for addiction services, which they don't provide. And they're primarily funded by government. And both agencies are stable financially and in their leadership. So I'm going to turn it over to Group 1. To just talk a little bit about what are some of the conversations you had. I don't think they used the mural for this, so we don't have to worry about that. So who's going to talk from Group 1?
I'll be the representative.
Perfect, thank you.
Awesome. Okay, well, we had a little bit of time. We had a really good discussion, and just based on the scenario, we felt that starting with a formal alliance as getting your feet wet, getting to understand each other's organizations, and sort of pilot testing something more permanent would be a good idea. So starting with a formal alliance, and we talked about both joint programming and some administrative consolidation. What did we talk about? We talked about maybe they could have a workshop with the larger organization, or maybe some clinic space in the larger organization to see how they operate together, and that it would certainly serve both organizations if they did. We talked about some of the risks involved in moving towards a more permanent relationship. The smaller agency had the risk of potentially losing its private donors that maybe had strong stakeholder presence in that small organization, but once amalgamated, may not want to continue funding the project. And so there was a risk in losing funding there. And from the larger agencies' risk, we sort of said, well, we can't, actually the smaller agency had another risk. We can't assume that the government funding that is going towards the larger agency would then go towards the smaller agency's projects or programming. And so we found that the smaller agency was sort of holding more risk in the amalgamation than the larger agency, which is often the case. And we talked about how in that scenario, when organizations amalgamate, there's the possibility for both of them to lose funding. So, for example, Leslie brought up the idea if both organizations had funding for some type of core infrastructure, but then they've made a merger, the funding agency might argue that now they're in a shared space and they need less money for infrastructure, in which case they'd lose funding. And so there's always these risks involved related to funding, I guess. And then we talked about the fact, well, Leslie again brought up the fact that governments often promote integration as a money saver, but it never actually is a money saver. It's usually, it just improves services, it improves the diversity of services and the efficiency of services, but it doesn't necessarily lower costs when amalgamating. And so that's something to just consider in the greater picture of moving towards a merger. So in summary, group one just said we would start with a pilot project of a formal alliance and move towards possibly a merger or amalgamation if it served both parties.
Great, thank you. You know, and the nice thing about this scenario is that both agencies are coming from a position of strength. While they might be different sizes, they both have uniqueness to offer that can be leveraged and benefit each other. So, that's a nice scenario to start with something, and, that it's maybe a little less structured than a corporate integration, and see how it goes. So thank you, group one. Let's go to group two. Group two scenario, we have two medium-sized agencies. So similar sizes. Agency A has had turnover in leadership multiple times over the years and is struggling financially due to some mismanagement. The board's primarily made up of the original founders of the agency. And Agency B has stable leadership and finances for years, strong financial practices in place. They provide different services than Agency A, but the two agencies share many of the same clients. So the same individuals access services from both agencies. And Agency B's strategic plans has identified growth as a strategic outcome. So group two. Tell us about your thoughts.
Okay, I will be talking on behalf of Group 2. So our initial thoughts were really that kind of Agency A was really at the end of its life cycle and looked for more of some form of corporate integration with Agency B, both being of similar size, but definitely having a shared client base that seemed to make sense. There would definitely, it would seem there would be some advantages in provision of services to clients, potentially reducing some redundancy there, and also being able to just offer better quality of service to that client base, but maybe housing all of the programming in one place in an agency that's better, that appears to be have stronger leadership and be better managed financially. I mean, there would definitely be some hard discussions on both sides of agencies when that would occur, and then some difficult decisions too to be made in terms of, do you retain your staff from both organizations to offer the same breadth of programming, or do you try to reduce that number as well, and then just have programming that's really just B specific, agency B specific. And we also kind of discussed the idea of potentially doing some rebranding so that it is very clear to clients that there's not going to be a loss of quality in services with this integration, but more of just an enhancement. Does Patty or Julia from our group, do either of you want to kind of add to any of that?
Nothing for me. I think you hit everything there, Julianne. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, and thanks to Julia for scribing as well. She was the neural expert here.
Yeah. The unfortunate part is Agency A is kind of left this into their position where they don't, they're not as desirable a dance partner, right? They are struggling. But with the board being made up of the founders, that might really create some emotional issues here. So something to think about. Well, thank you. Okay, let's go to scenario number 3. So in this scenario, we had one small agency, one medium agency. The small agency has highly valued niche programming, but only a few paid staff. And they have not been able to expand their services or presence in the sector due to a lack of infrastructure and administration systems. And the medium agency has solid program offerings and excellent administrative systems and processes. So they've even identified they have a bit of excess capacity in their administrative services. So someone from group 3.
We didn't really have a person decided, so I don't know. I guess I can talk unless somebody else from group 3 would like to talk.
Go for it, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew.
I'll try and summarize, but yeah, group 3, feel free to step in. We went with the thought that this would be best served within how we interpreted the scenario as a formal alliance. And as I was kind of looking at that, I was just sort of thinking we're probably coming from sort of this shared perspective that the couple of people in the smaller agency still really want to maintain their autonomy to how they deliver their programming. So I think that was kind of in the back of our minds when we went with the formal alliance. We're looking at how this option would impact each agency, and I guess the first thing is the smaller agency would have those increased resources and capacity for to handle their administration. And then the other side of that is it would free up the smaller agencies, couple of staff members, to be able to concentrate just on that niche program delivery, which it sounds like that's probably what they're, in our scenario, what they're really, really passionate about. There would be some loss of autonomy to both organizations would be a possibility. So we kind of discussed that would depend on what the relationship, the details of it look like, but obviously there'd be a power differential with the little agency that doesn't have administrative capacity and the larger one that does.
Yep.
That would be on the table. Then also it was mentioned by someone in our team that there could be leveraging of each other's resources, that relationship of everything for potentially more funding opportunities. And I kind of wonder how, that would impact probably most favorably the smaller organization for expanding that niche programming, because the larger organization already seems to kind of have that full spectrum of stuff going on.
Yeah.
Why did we choose it? Oh yeah, I guess, based on the administrative needs of the small organization, and as I mentioned before, their desire that we saw of retaining some autonomy. What are the potential issues? Just as mentioned, possible loss of power for the smaller nonprofit, getting kind of eaten up by the larger one. And what are some of the potential opportunities? Small agency, again, that additional staff for programming, and then also that capacity for developing their programming. And I guess for the larger agency, they must have a vested interest in wanting to have that smaller agency providing for that niche, because presumably that is one part that they're missing or not addressing. So there's probably needs beyond their programming for that.
Yeah, exactly. And as you said, this might be a really nice starting point, and you can stay there for as long as it works, or once they're doing that kind of joint programming or administrative support, they might start to realize that, maybe we don't need to maintain ourselves as separate entities. Maybe there's some merit to coming together in a more formal corporate integration. But the beauty of these is it gives you a chance to kind of play around with possibilities. And sometimes I think we get very focused on, what's a merger, it has to be a merger, but there's lots of options in between, and there's lots of ways to get together as organizations and see whether or not it's a good fit to try it out before you make any kind of permanent decision. So well done, everybody. Thank you so much. We're going to go back to get off mural and just move towards the end of our time here with Mike.
All right. Am I showing phases of planning? I hate when I start sharing. There we
Yeah,
go.
that's perfect.
An hour to set things up. So yeah, great stuff. And we want to walk you through what we would think are phases. Lots of ways to do this stuff, right? There's a lot, as Leslie said, lots of options where you design the process to fit who you are, what you're doing, what your needs are, both on the sort of impact side, the regulatory side, all this stuff. What we like to do is walk through a few different phases, folks, and to sort of stage it. And we build in what we call our off ramps along the way. So the first stage is that commitment, that sort of assessment. It's, are we actually going to do this? This is sort of getting to know each other a little bit so that it's structured, it can be formal, but you're analyzing different options. You haven't committed to one or the other. You're saying, okay, we can go a few different routes here, as Leslie said. We're gathering information, sharing, analyzing. We're trying to focus on the why again and the what. We're not trying to get to what's all going to look like in the end. We're not putting things together yet. We're just saying, is this conceptually something we're going to work with? And something we can take perhaps back to our boards to say, we need to enter into formal negotiations on and really start going down a path, whatever that might be. So we sort of do all these stages in sort of, there's some off ramps along the way. And the staging piece is really important because a lot of this is to bring people along. If it's just one person saying that this is a good idea, that's never going to work. You've got to make sure that you're bringing the whole group along, and that's the stages do really nicely for that. So some of the things we do along the way, just to press a button, it's not working. We go into, in stage one, we're doing things, we've got some sort of overview and facilitation. We like having groups do this kind of stuff, a task force, something to hold it, not just one. Ideally, you've got folks who are both management and governance on this. You need both. The management side tend to know all the nuts and bolts, so you kind of need those. The governance side that's who has the legal authority for the organization. Sometimes managers be a little conflicted because when you start talking about organizations perhaps going away, sometimes staff are part of that mix. So you need some of that. You're looking at things like culture and mission. You're creating an MOU to guide the work. And we get into due diligence and learning from others. Those are two different pieces. The due diligence is that informed decision making. Learning from others is good. Who's gone before you? Who's tried this stuff? Where are the pitfalls? Mergers, amalgamations, any alliance can fall apart at any time. And stuff you haven't seen, you think, oh, we're going along, and then oh, right turn, something happens, and maybe it's bad, maybe it's not. So there's lots of steps here, and to sort of take the time to lay out a pathway, put some stages in, and to decide whether to keep moving forward or not. Due diligence is something a part of any merger, and is the process to make sure that everybody in both on the task force negotiations committee in this slide, or everyone on the board have enough information they can make an informed decision to go to the next stage. So that's including, what's the liabilities, what are the assets along the way, what's the legal piece along the way, who needs to be informed, all those things. And they can really be complex. When you start doing due diligence work, there's a lot of areas you need to talk about. And these may change from organization to organization, or maybe sort of different for different structures. Values and culture, no matter what, we spend a lot of time with that. It's not just that you've got sort of, on paper, two programs that work. How is it actually going to fit with people? Regulatory and legal stuff, again, get some good advice that way. Governance, who makes the decision? Who's going to actually vote for these things in the end? Finances, things like that, can contracts move forward? So a whole range of things to walk through in terms of this stage of the planning. So you've got enough to say, yeah, conceptually we're good. Move on to the second stage. It's the final stage, or the next stage of planning. I'll turn that over to Leslie.
Yeah, so phase two, if you've come through phase one and decided to agree mutually to go to phase two, this is where you really get into the more detailed planning of what is this going to look like. So you're basically designing the future of the agencies. So figuring out, okay, HR, if we're going to be a merger, how do we want to address the staffing issues? Who's going to be the leader? What financial system are we going to use? And you basically go through all those areas of due diligence again and really start to sort through the details. And typically at the end of phase two, you actually have it implemented. And this is where it gets a bit tricky because you're still just planning. But you do need to typically get your society to vote if it's any kind of corporate integration. If you're staying with management, consolidation or just management supports or shared programming, joint programming, you don't typically need society approval. But if you're actually going into corporate integration where you're going to change the legal structure, that does typically require your society to approve it in addition to the boards. And then as we move on from there,
I hear you.
there's always a delay from the pushing of the to what comes up. Phase 3 is actually the integration, the actual implementation. And this is where the hard work of turning your vision of the future into reality starts. And this could take over a year. I mean, this is the really hard work, and this is where everybody's involved. And so there's all kinds of, again, depending on what you've decided to do. If you're merging, that means you're wrapping up one organization and dissolving it and transferring assets. If you're doing a different corporate integration, you might be creating a new organization. Again, this is where it gets a little bit more technical, and probably may want to make sure you have some good expertise supporting you along the way. And lastly, one thing that we do is we use a framework for communication. Communication is tricky because you spend a lot of time in the phases where you actually haven't made a final decision. And so it's a challenging to navigate, what can you communicate and to whom, and what not to communicate, because you don't really want to getting it out there that maybe these two organizations are considering a merger, because it's not a done deal. And so you don't want to scare staff and funders and donors and everything when it's too early in the conversation still. So it's really important that we're very, very intentional about what we're going to communicate. And as I said, we always spend time on this at every single meeting, talking about not only what we're going to communicate, but what we're not going to communicate. So anyways, with that, we're going to open it up for questions and answers. We had a number of questions posed to us when people signed up, so we can go to those. Or if there's anybody who has a question that's here today, we'd be happy to entertain. We know we're right at the end here. I appreciate we will stick around for a few minutes if you have any questions that you want us to go through.
I'll leave it for just a few moments here, as people might want to ask questions right now. Let's see.
I'm just going to pull from some of the questions that were submitted. One of the questions was, are there any funding or grant opportunities for organizations to explore this? And there are a couple of options. Again, it depends on, if you're a charity or a nonprofit, but the Calgary Foundation has funded some organizations to go through exploration processes and supported them along the way. There's some private foundations who have done some similar things. So, it depends a little bit on your organization and kind of what part of the sector you are in, but there has been some precedent set where funding organizations are willing to provide some support.
But it is a tricky one to fund, and there are the range of costs can be extensive whenever you go on these things. So to recognize it probably is going to cost agencies something out of their own pocket likely to go through this. If not in hard costs outside, certainly in kind is huge.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, we had a couple of questions kind of around how small nonprofits might work with this. So let's see. So I know we mentioned before when we were talking about some of the joint programming, how to start off kind of in early phases and not go all the way in. But how can small nonprofits effectively contribute without overextending themselves? And are there sort of best practices for folks and organizations that have fewer resources?
Yeah, again, this is the tough one because this takes time. This is not off the side of somebody's desk. And so it really has to be part of your strategic initiatives and something you're willing to put certainly some staff time into. And, and if you're a smaller organization, I certainly recognize that can be a challenge. But it's if you're exploring this, it's clearly because it's really important to you as an organization. And you really want to come from a position of strength. You don't want to wait until you're desperate to try to find somebody to dance with. So it's important to look to the future around sustainability and if necessary, do whatever you can to make sure that you at least budget some staff time and energy and resources into really exploring this if this is something that's important to your organization.
Yeah, and take a really hard look ahead, like take a really honest and really frank look ahead of what's ahead of you if you're smaller. And it's not that you're not in trouble, you're larger either, but if there's not a great sustainability path for you, then that, there's a question to answer there. But the challenge is even big or small, a lot of the pieces you need to do. The regulatory pieces don't change, you're big or small. The amount of resources you have to offer maybe is different, or the amount of time, but so you can pare down some things. Maybe the due diligence process isn't quite as big because you don't have that many moving pieces. But some parts, it doesn't matter the size. You still have to go through society pieces, you got to go through CRA pieces. And those don't go any faster, any slower, whether you're big or small necessarily. Yeah.
There's just a question here, Mike, about some considerations when a charity wants to work with a nonprofit. And feel free to jump in, Mike. But a charity can only, if you're looking at the charity winding up its affairs, a charity can only donate its assets to another charity.
Yeah, there's other regulatory things. Get advice on this one. So yeah, charities can only do things that are for charitable purposes. So you've got to make sure, even if you weren't winding up, that you can only do activities internally or externally that further your purposes. So probably an area to get some guidance on to make sure you're not running afoul. The big thing in all this, if you're a charity, is do not mess up your charitable status. So even before you get down into the paths, go talk to CRA, get some guidance on this stuff. That is an asset you have. You got to protect at all costs on these ones. So I'd say we wind her up to the closing here then. We've gone beyond. And so I would say, Liz, can you bring us home?
Yeah. So just thank you again, everyone, for the time and engagement here. I did pop in our evaluation survey in the chat. This is a new session, so we are interested in any and all feedback. And as mentioned, I will be sending out the recording and all of the really good resources that we have sort of referenced throughout today's presentation. Once that recording is ready, I'm sure that might be I think Monday at this point, then you'll receive an email from me. And if you're in need of any other support, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. I know a lot of today's session is very relevant to our one-on-one free clinics. And so, we do other developmental services as well, of course, in the realm of strategic alliances, but we do legal support, we do some strategic planning and governance workshops as well. So yeah, well, thank you so much for your engagement today, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything else.
Thanks,
everybody.
Take care.
Appreciate you joining us.